6:17 in Trinidad and Tobago. It's goalless after 17 minutes between Croatia, the beaten finalists of 4 years ago, and Morocco, another day of 4 games at the World Cup football finals. But let's focus on the Commission of Inquiry into the PARIA deaths, the tragedy where 4 divers lost their lives. Yesterday marked the second day of the public hearings, and the Commission heard the testimony of the lone survivor, Christopher Boudram. Boudram wept as he expressed sorrow and guilt at failing to fulfill his promise of returning for his brothers in the pipeline. He referred to them as his brothers, of course. Boudram broke down when he disclosed that at one point he had to forcibly yank his foot away from the grip of Kazim Ali Jr., who pleaded with him not to leave them behind, even though it was understood that he had to make his way out in order to get help for the others. Boudram further emphasized that all his colleagues were alive in the pipe, and had there been rescue efforts, they would have all been alive today. It's really, as I say, it's incredibly disturbing to think of those realities and what they would have gone through, and indeed the torturous manner of their deaths, and indeed now Boudram living through that all over again. Martin George, attorney at law, is with us to give a perspective on what he's heard from the proceedings so far. Mr. George, very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. Certainly testimony there that would have caused him to relive that terrible experience. Good morning to you.
Yeah, hi, good morning, Faziri, and good morning, Trinidad and Tobago. And, you know, Faziri, the way this is being played out in the national space, I think ought to give pause to consider in terms of the strategy adopted possibly, you know, in terms of how this is proceeding. I mean, of course, we can't comment on the evidence or, you know, anything that would impinge on the proceedings. But, you know, it's the way the author Malcolm Gladwell puts it. You know, sometimes in life you come to what is referred to as a tipping point, and I guess the blame game that it is playing out as in the national media, it does no good, certainly for the families of the victims. It does no good for, you know, the public perception of how this is like 2 titans, you know, slugging it out. And it appears that, you know, in all of this, the persons who are the true victims are being sidelined, in the sense that, you know, you ask yourself, what is the purpose of, you know, this public showdown between the 2 entities by way of this commission of inquiry? And you ask yourself if there couldn't be other ways of possibly resolving this so that there could be some sort of, I guess, recompense and closure for the families of the victims, as opposed to the way this is, you know, being unraveled in the public space. Because, for you, Trinidad and Tobago has had a history of these commissions of inquiry, which, you know, I mean, some of them have ended up being, you know, a grand national charade. And, you know, you are parading and you're strutting and you know, pirouetting in the public space. But sometimes the issue that you're trying to resolve gets lost in the mix, and you do not end up doing what the public may perceive as justice. I mean, as we're talking about the World Cup and FIFA, we can even go back to the Commission of Inquiry into, you remember the World Cup fiasco at this national stadium. We had a Commission of Inquiry for that. We've had commissions of inquiry into the Clico collapse, CL Financial. You know, we've had so many of them into Piaco Airport. We've had so many of these commissions of inquiry. And you ask yourself, whether from even from a PR perspective, I guess for both entities, whether this really is turning out to be the best methodology of resolving it. I mean, and this is not from a legal perspective at all that I'm saying this, I mean, because, Fazil, we are all human beings at the end of the day, regardless of our our calling, our duty, so we cannot escape that human element. And I think that's where the public sentiment resonates in this matter. And if one were to see the reactions or, the responses from members of the public, it would certainly give pause to consider whether this really is having the effect that one wants in this matter.
And I understand why you're treading so very carefully around the issue and so on, because the hearings are on. But could I answer your question in the sense that this is going to end up just as all our commissions of inquiry have ended up? Because sadly, this is such a polarized nation, Martin George, that even the most intelligent and well-heeled, as opposed to for want of a better term, the lowest of the low, that polarization remains. And sadly, these matters are seen in that context. But again, to put it in, remember when this tragedy initially transpired, the recommendation by the Prime Minister at the time was an investigative committee, and there was a clamor from the opposition, hence the establishment of a commission of inquiry. So, having said all of that, I suppose what is unique about this one, and I'd like to get your opinion on it, is that there is a survivor. And maybe there are many out there who wish he had died, because, dead men tell no tales, but he's alive. And therefore, he's able to give his testimony, and however it goes, we will see whether it makes a difference. But the fact is that you have a survivor from such a tragedy giving his testimony. Do you think that is actually going to have any impact on swaying those who would be persuaded one way or the other normally?
Well, I mean, it is inescapable, the conclusion that, his testimony would be impactful. And as the person who was there on the scene, he would be able to describe things in gripping and vivid detail, which I think must tug at the heartstrings of anyone hearing that evidence. Of course, in determining these matters, one is not guided by emotion, but one cannot divorce oneself from the reality of the tragedy which occurred. 4 men died. That's not in dispute. And somebody has to take the responsibility. And one would have thought that maybe both sides might have used this opportunity, separate and apart from, I guess, seeking to make reparation to the families of the deceased. But one would have thought that we would have used this opportunity as a nation also to now say, well, look, going forward, let's establish proper standards, guidelines, codes, practices, procedures, or if they are established already, let's make sure that we rigorously implement them and police them so that we learn as a nation. And you see, that's where leadership comes about, Fazil. In other words, part of leadership involves being able to say, hey, listen, okay, I recognize a mistake was made. Let's learn from it and try to move forward. But in Trinidad and Tobago, because we have so many tin gods, and as the learned author Vidya Naipaul described them as mimic men, occupying positions of power, privilege, and prestige. Nobody ever wants to admit or say, well, hey, there's a mea culpa. I recognize that something went wrong. I admit, and let us try and fix this and move forward. Instead, everybody digs their heels in. You suit up with a battery of attorneys, and usually at state expense, you pay in millions of dollars to fight and, entrench yourself in your positions, rather than sometimes taking the holistic, mature, rational overall view and say, hey, listen, all right, yes, we recognize something went wrong. Let's see how we can do better going forward. But
And
that never seems to happen in Trinidad and Tobago.
And I'd like to get your perspective on this because I know you're a man of history, obviously as an attorney at law, and in your practice you would delve way back when. I think the last time you referenced something from 1858 as far as legislation and so on. But can you recall a situation where, and this is outside of the specifics of the testimony and this valve and this certificate and that certificate, a situation where individuals were trapped in whatever situation. I remember the miners in Chile who were trapped in 2010 for 30 days and were eventually rescued.
Yes,
That you have a
schoolboy,
situation
yes.
where individuals were trapped underwater, as in this case, but trapped anywhere. And everybody just stood by and indeed prevented people from at least attempting to rescue them. Are you aware of any similar circumstance?
It's difficult, I mean, one begins to think even back to the Titanic, where the band played on, if you understand me. And,
Sure.
it's almost reminiscent of that type of scenario where you basically are in a scenario facing death, the ship is sinking, and you instruct the band, look, let's carry on as normal, continue playing your piece. And that's why I say, for you, sometimes in assessing these things, one has to maybe sometimes step back, because in the heat of the battle, of course, yes, you want to keep fighting, you want to keep challenging, you want to keep, but sometimes maybe you might want to consider from an overall perspective, from a public perspective, to say, well, hey, listen, should I really pursue this in this manner, especially if things are unraveling the way they might appear to be in a public scenario? So I mean, of course, it's entirely up to the parties to decide how they wish to pursue it. But one has to also be mindful of the families of the victims. I mean, even the survivor. I mean, whatever he would have gone through. One cannot discount that and the emotions that must be welling up inside him as he has to relive this type of scenario. And ask oneself, is this really the best way for us as a nation to deal with this tragedy? Because this is not only being played out locally for zero, regionally and internationally, there's tremendous interest in this matter. Because you're talking about standards for the industry, you're talking about, questions being asked as to, how could this have happened? How could we prevent it in the future? And I think that's really where we as a nation of Trinidad and Tobago should be focused. We should now try to be maybe standard bearers for the future, for the industry to say, well, hey, listen, we are going to be implementing the most rigorous procedures, practices, and protocols in the industry, and we will ensure that everybody is trained, certified, that everybody knows what they're supposed to do. We all follow the codes and the regulations strictly. And maybe that would be a way of TNT rehabilitating its image in terms of this tragedy, and even for the parties, rather than this the way this scenario is playing out at this commission of inquiry.
And as a final point, Martin George, and we thank you as always for taking the time. What confidence do you repose in one, the Commission actually making its recommendations, but more importantly, those recommendations and the report actually being made public?
Well, I think you know the answer to that as well as I do. Let's just look at the history of Trinidad and Tobago and, our track record with these commissions of inquiry. I mean, if you recall, at the end of nearing the end of the testimony in the CL Financial Inquiry, Commission of Inquiry, when they wanted to, get Mr. Dupree to give his evidence, and he basically thumbed his nose at the commission and said, I'm not coming anywhere. and then they had to admit that they had no power to subpoena him or compel his testimony or compel his attendance, then you ask yourself then, what really is the objective? Look how many reports we've had, the Mustel report, we've had, so many commissions of inquiry where we produced thousands and thousands of pages of volumes of reports, and we have the findings and the recommendations, and nothing is ever implemented. In fact, sometimes we've had commissions of inquiry where even the report has not been made public, if you understand me. So I mean, it really begs the question as to what is the objective. As you say, maybe it might have been influenced by the politics, and maybe as a reaction to quell the cries of the opposition. The Prime Minister said, well, let's have a commission of inquiry. But is it really just kicking the can down the road, as opposed to trying to really get a deep, meaningful, and lasting solution to this scenario, both for the families of the victims and for the nation of Trinidad and Tobago?
Probably more like kicking the dustbin down the road, because this country really is a dump when it comes to dealing with these issues. Much like Port of Spain is a dump right now, especially with the flood waters by the abattoir, which has been with us for about a couple of weeks now. Martin George, we thank you very much indeed for taking the time to be with us this morning.
Thanks a lot, Fazir, and a good morning to you.
Indeed, 6:33 in Trinidad and Tobago. Still 0-0 between Croatia and Morocco in the opening game of 4 today at the World Cup football finals. As we go to a break, our viewer captured this image of another sunset. This one we think would have been taken. Well, it would have to be a sunrise if it's the East Coast. It's the east coast looking to the west. But if you're on the east coast looking to the west, you'd be looking over land, wouldn't you? Looking towards the west. But they say it's a sunset, so let's go with that because it is from one of our viewers. But it's very, very nice anyway as we go to the break.